Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session and thank you for attending. Got great pleasure of introducing Dr. Jonathan Katz, someone I've been working closely with on a few projects over the last 4 or 5 months, and can honestly say I've never left the conversation with Jonathan without learning something. So really intrigued and interested to see this session. So thank you, Jonathan, for supporting Learning Week, and over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning, folks. I'm going to share and then we'll make a start. Can I check whether folks can see that okay? Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Alex. The astute of you will notice that I didn't make a mistake on the title and just cross it out. I put a line through disability on purpose. And that comes from a comment I heard years ago when somebody said, there's nothing broken in disability sport. It's perfectly good. And so para sport is preferred. Looking here at some of the psychological considerations or the factors that can influence what a coach or others in clubs might need to be aware of in supporting athletes with a disability or para athletes when they enter into sport and then progress once they've entered into different layers of sport, be it participation or be it performance. You can see on this slide there's the 4 broad areas that I've mentioned that I'm going to look at, which is some of the context around the athlete, the process of change and the adaptation, and then specific implications for the sport itself, and the so what. So what does that mean for us as coaches and supporters of athletes in that environment? One of the key things to think about is in the background is how is this person what is the relationship this person has with their disability. And the top of this list looks at the idea, is a person have a congenital disability, i.e. from birth, and or has it been acquired. And they're 2 different starting points. They're both implications, but they're different implications. One of the implications is they have lifelong accessibility challenges. When I was talking with a short person, a label that used to be given as a dwarf, they said to me once, I've never seen myself as disabled because I was born this way. They became called disabled in order to be classified, in order to go to Paralympic Games. So for them, they haven't lost anything in life, which is different to somebody who was born non-disabled and then has an acquired disability through illness or injury. In which case, how they are now is different to how they were before, certainly physically, physiologically, and perhaps psychologically. And then this has some impacts on how people then adapt. One of the challenges in the adaptation, and this is similar to people who do not have a sporting background who enter sport, is going from in quotes a person to an athlete. This is particularly those folks who want to go into performance sport. Those who were on the panel on Monday, there was a talk around the identity of being an elite performer and what that means when you may have lost that. And there's the impact of the demands that are associated with all of that. So I've spoken about change and adjusting to change. So the question becomes, well, adjusting what? And you can see in this graphic, these four broad areas, the physically, psychologically, behaviorally, and socially, are areas that require some adaptation to within the engagement to sport. And I'll be unpacking what this looks like in subsequent slides. So bearing in mind there are layers of change and different types of change that occur. One of the experiences I found when I was working with parasport, and particularly preparing people for various Paralympic Games, is the athletes who'd acquired a disability. Was interesting is what was their pre-injury or illness experience like, and how did that influence what happened next. One person said to me, this was a person who had a high lesion spinal cord injury. They said to me they didn't like disabled people before they became disabled. They became disabled and they still didn't like being around disabled people. So notwithstanding the event that they and the accident and their life change, their pre-accident attitudes persisted. So it provided a challenge for them when they were traveling and around with people with disability. Some people had very little experience of being around disability and therefore didn't, in quotes, know how to behave or respond, notwithstanding their own change. Also, interestingly, um, people who'd had other challenges to face prior to the injury that resulted in the disability found that some prior coping with other experiences they could utilize in this challenge that they were currently facing or recently faced. So prior coping. The idea to which people value themselves based on their own internal um, strengths and attitudes, in contrast to I'm good because I have this position, I hold that role. And if through the disability that role is no longer available, then the self-esteem takes a bigger knock, potentially. So having a level of self-esteem internally referenced, it was deemed helpful. And you'll see that theme emerge. And around thinking styles and coping, which I've touched on already, having more flexible, adaptive coping styles and thinking styles. And for some people, they have or had very little sporting experience prior to. There's one person who was caught up in an event that they were completely their life was independent from sport, and here they were on a talent potential program for Paralympic Games. So that the expectations of elite sport, having done no sport whatsoever in a period of about 6 to 8 months. That's an incredibly short time for that change to occur. When you think a non-disabled athlete may take that may take something like 5 or 6 or 7 years to get to that same point or a similar point. So the adaptation is quite different. So their past sporting experience is something to be aware of. Other factors influencing the adaptation is the reason for how they've become disabled. And you'll see I have a dotted line here between congenital disability and the others for the reasons I've already spoken about. When I was working as a group of people, what I originally saw walking in were a group of people sitting around with various disabilities, and it was tempting to see them all as the same. They were quite different, and part of the difference is how they got there. Some folks were there because they had a progressive degenerative illness. Sometimes that takes a long period of time. There was one young athlete that when I met them, they would have been about 16 or 17. Within the space of 48 hours, they went from completely healthy to having a condition that affected the speed of how the messages were sent along the nerves. So to use a modern term, they went from fiber optics broadband to dial-up overnight in terms of the messages. So the messages were being sent. They just took such a long time to get there. They were effectively paralyzed for a period of time. They did regain some of that. So there's a change. Sudden or not, the more sudden it is, the more unexpected, the bigger the change in a much shorter time. So there's an adaptation, less time to prepare and adapt. Was it unexpected? Just going about your day-to-day life. For example, the athletes I've worked with who were part of the 7/7 bombings, going about their daily life, they were fine, then they weren't. Some, when they were undertaking what was seen as dangerous activities or dangerous sports. I worked quite a bit in para-skiing, and there were several people on the para-skiing squad who acquired their disability through injury while skiing as a non-disabled person. So that's spinal cord injuries as a result of skiing accidents or snowboarding accidents. And some folks who acquire an accident as part of their work. For example, a number of folks from the military. So increasingly, there are folks in parasport who've come through from the military, and it's known this could happen. So it's, while shocking, it's less of a surprise psychologically. I spoke a moment ago around the level of physical literacy pre-accident. One of the attributes many military folks bring is a physical literacy through their training and so on that can be adapted for sport. The biggest one that can be adapted is the mentality around training and understanding how to train and how to become ready physically. And also the emotional challenges around pushing the body quite hard in training contexts. There are a couple of factors also that are fairly important. And the degree that the person perceives themselves to have control in and around the events they face is very significant. If somebody feels they're in a situation, they were trapped and they had no control on it, that sense of feeling out of control can persist afterwards. People who are stuck in difficult position, but they feel they were able to influence, however little, their circumstance, that also persists or can persist. So perceived control is very important in and around the time of the accident injury and the immediate period afterwards. the quality of care, being kept informed, being listened to, not being made worse. I know several people who, as a result of some early intervention, the level of disability was worse than it needed to have been. So there's a secondary injury, if you like, and that can result in a fair degree of resentment for some folks. Being kept informed and being listened to is really important because that's a degree of perceived control. I'm engaged in this. The reaction of people close, um, and this is really to understand the degree of social support. I know some folks that said their families were so upset by what happened that they weren't able to provide the support they needed. Not through wanting to be harmful, but because they were going through their own concerns in a parallel way. So they became more socially isolated. And the degree of what's different, how much needs to be changed. For example, if you're somebody um, that's lost two limbs, so say both legs, that's one experience. If you've lost both arms, it's both two limbs, but it's a different experience because what you can do with legs you can't do with arms in terms of day-to-day living, etc. So it makes a difference. And the final point here is the result of the injury or the accident, is it stable? In other words, someone with a spinal cord injury or with an amputation, typically, once that's managed, then that's how they will be going forwards, unless there's some other unexpected event that happens. If you have a medical condition that may be progressively worse, I've put multiple sclerosis, MS here, muscular dystrophy, are two that come to mind. That the the level of loss cannot say I'm now managed it because it continues. So it's a continual concern as opposed to a static concern. And as an aside, those who are going to performance sport and you end up into going to um, classification, if you have a progressive condition, your classification is done repeatedly. And I'll talk about an implication of that a bit later. Distinct from a static classification for a known level of ability disability. I've spoken about change and loss. This this graphic here is taken from one of the key authors in bereavement, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. In the original theory, she refers to stages of bereavement from A to B to C to D in that way. It's very clear over time that bereavement doesn't happen in a linear step-by-step way. It happens in a cycle that repeats over a period of time. So it's more iterative, and that's why I've represented it here. And you can see on the slide the kinds of challenges loss and change require, or many people will go through. Not everyone will go through all of them, and not all of them will have the same level of impact. So one person may struggle more with anger, frustration, others might more with depression, anxiety, others might struggle more with accepting it's happened. at different times. Bargaining is often if if you're the person who's been bereaved, wanting to take the other one's place, wanting to do anything to turn the clock back. And whilst this is not necessarily what the person who's experienced the loss may feel, there may be family members who would wish that's the case. And an example, I worked with a family in which a family were driving. There was an accident. One of the children was left in a wheelchair, and the father couldn't get over, feeling they were responsible and they would do anything to swap places. So that's an example of that, the family dynamic in terms of the support. So bargaining may happen, um, but the main reason, to summarize why I wanted to show this slide, is there are typical experiences people will go through psychologically and emotionally alongside, in quote, significant loss or change. So a loss that requires a change. There's a typical sequence of events. Someone's okay and something happens, and there's an immediate need. They may require immediate medical intervention. Once that the urgency or crisis scenario is more managed, then it becomes clearer what are the medium-term needs. What are the physical care needs? For example, when I've traveled with some athletes, they'll travel with a full-time carer. So they'll have a range of care needs alongside. These are the same care needs that they'll need at home: bathing, changing, toileting, etc. The fundamental, what are termed activities of daily life. And that's clearly a difference compared to non-disabled athletes. Once these are identified, then there'll be physical and social rehabilitation. And this can be ongoing over a period of time. And then psychologically, once there's a degree of management and things being a little bit more settled in terms of adapting to what's happened and the initial factors, only then do some of the deeper emotions emerge. What happens here are these medical physical needs are taking priority. The emotional experience is occurring, but it's being put secondary to these other more pressing medical needs, and they effectively become bottled. And once the person feels physically settled, in quotes, a little bit safer, then some of these emotions become more conscious and more felt. You'll notice that here things are being done to you, or if I'm the person who's been injured, being done to me. Medics make decisions. Families may make decisions for me, so I have much less direct control of things that are happening to me that I will need to manage going forwards. And this is when things start to catch up. And it's a paradox, because people, when I've worked with, will say to me, I was doing physically, I was much better. I was getting around and about. I was beginning to, and I remember finding this originally a strange comment from a wheelchair user. They said to me, "I'm beginning to find my feet again, where in day-to-day life." And then I found myself feeling even worse. And what was happening is they were feeling safe enough for the feelings to come out. And sometimes this may occur when they gain entry into sports, or sometimes when they go into a sporting environment, being in that space may remind them of things. So it might be one of the precipitators for this. So this is a very familiar trend. It's made to look nice and neat in steps. It's not. I don't think it's experienced in this nice, neat way. But I think as coaches and support people, it can be useful to have that consideration. Notice again the theme of where's the control or the perceived control in this process for the four young people. What would a less helpful process of adaptation look like? So this is from the outside looking in. What might we notice? I don't think there's anything of surprise on this slide. People may well feel anger, frustration, aggression. Anger, frustration, anger may be outbursts, frustration being anger turned inward, blaming others, the situation, the world, etc. There can be traumatic stress. There's been a traumatic event, and there may be stress linked to that. This is my pedantic psychologist hat on. Traumatic stress is not the same as PTSD. PTSD is used very widely. It's actually a very precise clinical term with a clear diagnostic criterion. So not all traumatic stress is in fact PTSD. That requires a specific diagnosis. In coping with all these pent up emotions and experiences, there may be addictions, alcohol and other drugs, for example. There can be avoidance and denial. I'm fine, I'm good, and so on. It's not that bad, I don't need help. Some people might become very, very, very low mood, and they become very insecure. Remember I spoke about the level of self-esteem before, and if somebody had built their self-esteem on something external they've now completely lost, and I'm worthless without that because that was everything to me, I'm now nothing. That can become, if left over time, depression, and the insecurity can show itself in anxiety and panic. I'm now talking about clinical terms as well as more general terms. Behavior, there can be significant sleep disturbance. One of the factors may well be physical pain and discomfort. I remember talking with people with amputations who would have phantom pain, which is pain from the limb that was removed, and so on. And with the sleep disturbance, they can begin to turn day into night. So they'll be up all night instead of sleep all day. So that can happen. It also is an avoidance. It also gives them a lot of time to think, and that may not be helpful. I really want to highlight that I am not in any way want you to be left with the message that I'm blaming these folks for doing something wrong. I'm absolutely not. These are genuine, honest experiences. They're unhelpful because they get in the way of a more adaptive outcome. They stop the resolving things emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally. They get in the way of that. They are absolutely real and genuine, and I accept them without condition. I emphasize that. If I were to write that, it would cover the whole screen in bold and underlined. So what can help adaptation? This can help people adapt, full stop. And many of these skills I'm going to talk about here are also included in what are termed psychological skills or mental skills in sport. So some of those mental skills in sport you may be familiar with derive from some of these concepts here. The idea of acceptance and tolerance. Accept something's happened because it happened. Tolerate the frustration because it's frustrating. Minimize judgment, or if at all possible, and accept that things will go wrong. I will make mistakes. Maybe others have made mistakes. That doesn't mean they did this on purpose. There's a, there's a big emphasis on problem solving. What's the issue? Solve the problem. Learn to transfer from bed to wheelchair to a toilet, for example, or a wheelchair into a car back into the wheelchair. If you're doing fencing, from the day chair into the sporting chair on the frame. These are problems to be solved, and one of the things that Nick Diper spoke about on Monday is the idea of recognizing what needs to be done, to find ways in collaboration with athletes in how to do that. I want to add emotion focused coping, and that's recognizing that there may be some emotional experience, psychological experiences that are occurring parallel with the practical problems. They need to be addressed concurrently. Remember, I spoke about sometimes the emotions get bottled early doors. And if we're not careful, we can inadvertently repeat that pattern when folks come into sport. Recognizing that I can influence my situation. And there are three important psychological needs here: autonomy, competency, and relatedness. Autonomy is where I can see myself influencing my circumstance, being included, making some choices. Competence is seeing myself have a goal, make some steps, and achieve it. I can do stuff. I can progress. And he has evidence to back that up. Competence. And relatedness is to do with feeling other people have my back, that other people are on my side. And one of the things that Piers and Dimitri both said when they started, for those on that talk on Monday, is they were fortuitous in both of their first coaches made stuff happen. They were welcome, they were supported, made stuff happen. Relatedness, this can be okay. And they also said, well, that if that doesn't happen, they wouldn't come back. I give you an example. One of the very first trips I went with a sport, it was in the athletes were in the call room before going out, and they couldn't leave. And one of them asked me if I could go and get a water bottle. Of course, I went out and got a water bottle and came back. Fast forward about 4 years, when we finished working together, they said to me, had I asked you to bring the water bottle and you'd not done it, I would never have spoken to you again. That was their test of would I support them in practical things, not just this someone coming from outside, the psychologist coming in from outside, sort of swanning in, doing stuff and leaving. That had been their prior experience. So relatedness is measured by being and doing these things, these small things that have big value, big psychological value. And they may be completely unaware to me, as that was, completely unaware to me, but meant something to them. So if somebody asks, and remember, for somebody who has a disability, will tend not to ask for help unless they really feel they need it. So it takes a lot to ask. Respect that as a rule of thumb for me. And finally, there's appraising risk. One of the things that people who've experienced a traumatic event is they can feel very vulnerable. They were okay and they not, and they become on standby, waiting for the next threat to happen, the next problem to happen. So their appraisal of a risk is higher, and the degree of it is greater. So they're looking for it. And the secondary appraisal is reinforcing my ability to cope and manage. So even if something did happen, I can cope, either independently and or with support. And that's where relatedness is so important. There are people who have got my back if I need them. So what does that mean in more practical terms? Athlete comes into the cell and wants to fence. Please start where they are. Why are they there? Some want to fence. Some want to fence for physical and social rehab reasons. They want to build that confidence. Others want to become performers. Some don't know about this, but that emerges once they start to fence. That's no different to anyone coming to the cell for the first time. Why are they there? And what does that mean? What does that mean for me as the coach? It helps me to help them knowing why they're there. By doing that, I'm informally starting some goal setting. Why are you here? I want to come and build in some of my physical literacy, my strength physically, and engage with the people. Great. What would that look like for you? These are goals. Remember the competency I spoke about? Already starting to support it. So why are they here? Once people are there, even though they're there for good reasons, there may be things that might activate or trigger some concerns. I've spoken about the first one already. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming being around that many people. And if you're a coach and you work in parasport, the first time you go into a room where you are in a minority, it's quite an opening eyes moment. For some people, they begin to recognize, if they have been active before, that their body now can't do what it used to be able to do. So it may be heightening what they've lost a bit more. There can be things they can be assessed on results in performance sports, but but effects on the outcome are not down to themselves. I'll use some example. One of the characteristics of people with a number of disabilities are having involuntary body spasms. One of the sports I worked in was indoor target shooting, where being still was super important. Critical moment, lining up the shot, as they took it, involuntary body spasm, they had a poor shot. In the qualification round in that event, in order to even get a chance of making the final, you needed to get 60 shots of 10 or above in the qualification. They ended up with 59 because of this spasm. That cost them going into a final. That cost them a potential final position or podium position, which had an impact on questions around funding through no fault of their own. But that was not taken into any consideration because things are assessed an outcome. Remember I said about tolerance and acceptance? Really hard and necessary. Some people are quite concerned about, I've already lost a lot, I don't want to risk losing more. I'm thinking of some sports. I'm working with some people who did track cycling. So the risk of falling, of injuring, was great. Was a concern. So they began to compete tense because they were anxious. They compete tense. They're anxious. It actually increases the risk of falling. And sometimes in sports, for those who've been at a very important event for you, um, if you get the outcome you want, it feels very strong. If you don't get the outcome you want, it also feels very strong. The intense emotional reaction, not the content of the emotion, but the power of the emotion, can trigger the reminder of the power of the previous emotions linked to when the disability was acquired. I spoke about earlier. It's particularly so in international sport where the intensity is even greater than it can be domestically. A couple of examples. I worked with an athlete, a wheelchair athlete, had a collarbone broken, surgery, couldn't use their arm. In effect, their arm was the same as the hip as well as the shoulder, because it meant they couldn't transfer and move from chair to bed to toilet, etc. They couldn't dress themselves, they couldn't toilet themselves. They were required to start to catheterize to go to the loo. That that necessary activity took them back to when they were catheterized following injury when they were in the spinal cord unit a few years before. So even though they knew it was necessary, it was still quite a complex emotional consequence for a collarbone injury. There was an athlete I worked with who had sight, vision concerns, and they were being classified in their sport for vision. And one of the things that they did is that the loss of the vision part of from the accident, they are in classification. You were being looked at to see that you aren't trying to get into a classification group where you become the most able in that group, because it becomes a performance gain. So you fake being worse than you actually are. Some people will do this. So now you're going into an event, you've lost something, and now somebody is saying to you, "Are you lying to me?" So they weren't being believed. It took them back to not being consulted when they had the early experience. So the classification process is uncomfortable, but it can also have other psychological consequences, clearly different from any non-disabled experience. The adaptation process for loss and change, in quotes, normally is typically anywhere between 3 to 5 years. So if you are coaching somebody and it's about 3 or 4 years after their accident and they start to experience these things, I would call that normal. They may be quite uncomfortable for me if I'm not familiar and don't know what to do about it, but that doesn't mean it's a problem. If it's 10 years later and it's coming back then I have a different question. So knowing this time frame is quite useful to understand how much I need to worry about it as the coach. Promote that internal locus of control, that intrinsic motivation, and to acknowledge achievements. Now, if any of you have spoken with high level performers and you ask them to be satisfied with their performance, even though they didn't get the result they wanted, almost none of them will accept that very comfortably. And even if they did get the result they wanted, they may still go, yes, but it should have been better. It's necessary for sustainability and managing healthy thinking to have a balance of wanting the external results and having an internal calibration as well. Because that's what the person lives with when they leave the cell, when they leave the competition. That's what stays with them in the rest of their life and their circumstance. And this idea of mastery of coping. So that last bullet point is a summary of what I've just said. Some para athletes can feel, by comparison to non-disabled colleagues, hypersensitive. So the same circumstance can be felt more intensely, more acutely, which can mean they might withdraw when from the outside there's a modest challenge, or they can try and overcompensate and jump in too quickly. Please encourage folks to access their pre-accident illness resources. So whilst may have experienced something and they've lost something, they still have the knowledge and experience of what they had before. And these last two bullet points I'll summarize with this example. I was working with an athlete who they had an accident and they were left in a wheelchair with a spinal cord injury. And in the conversation, their whole mindset became before and after the accident. They acquired the disability in an accident. And I remember they were talking about a way of how they were trying to cope with and manage something in their sport. And I asked them a question. This way you're managing this, out of interest, is any of that familiar to how you managed similar things before you were injured, before you were in the chair? And they were completely surprised by the question. And then well, they were even more surprised by the answer they gave, which was yes. The message was very clear. Not everything they experienced was because of the injury. It may have been who they were before, both helpful or unhelpful. So it's normalizing that. So in summary, there's this before, this sub-event, and I will emphasize that people who have interest sports who have a congenital disability may still have accessibility issues in terms of environment, socially, etc. So they will be very similar entering into sport, and then there's sustaining and maintaining that. And you can see in these boxes the summary of the main points, and I want to finalize that with this idea of maintain it, link who they were before and utilize their previous resources, both in how that influenced what's happened here and how it influences what we see as coaches and others in the sporting environment. Thank you.